Al Jazeera senior political analyst Marwan Bishara joins me here in the studio now. And so let me maybe start by getting your reaction to some of the thoughts that Aidan was expressing just there, which is this describing how Israel has abandoned respect for democracy and human rights. I mean, I suppose, 7, 8 months of brutality in Gaza, but actually many decades of brutal occupation. Some would say the decision today is, I suppose, symptomatic of this political impunity that has been enabled by Israel's Western allies as well. Absolutely.
I do take exception to the idea, kind of a generalized idea, that Israel is a democratic state and what it's doing now is not conducive to its nature. I think that's total BS. Israel is not a democratic state. Israel is a Jewish majority state. It's a Jewish state, and it's been saying so for the past 75 years, but for some reason its friends continue to talk about it as a democratic state. It is not a democratic state, except for its Jewish majority. That's one. Two, Israel has allowed the likes of Aljazeera and others to broadcast from Israel over the past so many years, not because it's democratic, because it was confident. Because Israel has long been a confident state, supported by the likes of the United States and other European powers. And hence, although I just flew into Doha and I just heard the news, the first sentiment I have is, of course, anger. One can only be angry, and especially what's going to happen to our colleagues in Jerusalem. And if I have one word of warning to the people in Israel there, is you better be careful with our colleagues, and they should never be touched again, because we had enough people killed and injured in Israel-Palestine. But more importantly, my anger because of this decision is tempered with a different kind of sentiment. And it's based on my understanding, my analysis of why this decision has come about. The immediate explanation is that this is a right-wing fascist government that is to its character to take such decisions. But I think more importantly, by taking this decision at this point in time, Israel is showing weakness and desperation. This Netanyahu government, unlike previous governments, including Netanyahu governments in the past, who were confident enough to take the reporting from Al Jazeera at face value, this new government, it feels so exposed because of its war crimes, because of its record of the past 6 months, that it needs to ban Al Jazeera, because it feels that its standing around the world is being compromised when free press reports the facts on the ground.
Well, so how then, this is going to affect the flow of information that is going from Gaza, from the West Bank to the outside world. So,
well, definitely,
in that sense, they will have achieved their aim.
They're certainly trying to curtail, reduce, even block what is happening in Gaza from reaching the rest of the world. What's happening in the West Bank? What's happening in Jerusalem? What's happening within Israel itself to the rest of the world? Because our reporting, it's kind of. Okay, let's go back to a bit of the words being used. So they are accusing us of incitement. But reporting is not incitement, except when you are reporting on war crimes. It sounds like it's incitement. So if I say to an objective observer, Israel has killed almost 40,000 people, most of them are children and women, it sounds like an incitement. In fact, it's reporting. And in fact, it's admitted by every other European and American official that is close to Israel. In fact, it's admitted by Israelis themselves. If you say that Israel destroyed such residential buildings, so many hospitals, it sounds like an incitement. In fact, it's reporting the facts of the war that is taking place in Gaza. So they continue to speak and to relieve themselves of the charge of totalitarianism and repression by saying we are stopping incitement. In fact, they are stopping reporting the facts, bitter facts of the war that is taking place on Gaza, on the West Bank, on the Palestinians since October 7. Now, make no mistake, We at Al Jazeera, we reported October 7, just like we reported about everything since October 7. And we've reported about pre-October 7, just as also we reported on October 7. So now, by their attempt to block what we've been reporting to the rest of the world, I think although it's an act of desperation, I don't think it's going to succeed, because these images in a world of social media, in a world of cellular phones, in a world of instant messaging, they're not going to be able to stop. If anything, the message now is going to be probably more dramatic, more tragic, more chaotic. At least at Al Jazeera, we have editors. At Al Jazeera, we tend to, know what is the priority. With certain images, we blur, right? In social media, they don't do that. No. The reality on the ground in Gaza, the war crimes in Gaza, are going to be transmitted on social media to the rest of the world, and maybe it will be part of our own broadcasting.
But I guess it's limiting the flow of information and trying to gain some control of the narrative. It's an important part of this, but the timing is also very interesting at perhaps a delicate point in mediation efforts that so far have failed, just when they've been threatening an invasion of Rafah that would have a devastating effect on a population that's already suffered so much. I suppose this is also the Prime Minister caving in, making concessions to his rivals within his own government, who've been pressuring him to generate an even harsher response on the Palestinians. It's quite remarkable in a way, Marwan, that though he's being pulled in different directions by the Israeli public, by his coalition partners around the war in Gaza, and while his political future remains in the balance, he still has managed to survive.
He is certainly a political survivor. And he's a political survivor because he's able to do the balance between his coalition of right-wing fascists and some of his partners that are to the center-right, like Gantz and Eisenkot and so on and so forth. But I take issue, this time not with our guest, but with you. I take issue with the perspective that Israel's problems is Netanyahu's problem. It's not. Netanyahu is the culmination of what Israel looks like today. He is not defining Israel. Israel today, with its various political forces, are defining who Netanyahu is. Netanyahu is it's not a magician. He understands the mindset in Israel and he acts accordingly. He is an opportunist, a political animal, a master of the game that knows how to move the pieces around in order to stay in power. He wouldn't be able to do that if there isn't a 64-strong coalition of extreme right parliamentarians in Israel out of 120. So while we continuously talk about him being blackmailed by his more fanatical, more fascist coalition partner, in fact, he is playing them as much as they are trying to blackmail him. Today, Israel, after 75 years of dispossessions of Palestinians, after 57 years of occupation, after 70 years of siege of Gaza, and after the incredible death and destruction of the past 6 months, this what Israel looks today. That's not what Netanyahu looks today. But Netanyahu is as I said, the culmination. He's the vitrine. He's the window dressing.
Yeah, he's the manifestation of a reality that is already there, rather than being the master who is manipulating the political forces, but you're saying that they are essentially using each other for their own purposes.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, he's not like a master of marionette. He's not kind of playing everyone because he's such a genius. He's not. Actually, if you look at...
He wants to avoid jail, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's a personal career, there's personal interest, there's personal future. There's no doubt about that. But if you look at the literature by serious Israelis, Zionists, mainstream, and so on and so forth, and their critique of Netanyahu, they just tell you how limited he is. He is basically uneducated. He's unintellectual. But he speaks English well because he did his high schooling and even part of his middle schooling in the United States when his father worked in the United States. So he speaks English well, right? And he likes to speak in sound bites. But that, in fact, covers for a whole other shallow, superficial aspect of Netanyahu. He is not a man who's ever written anything of interest to anyone except an egotistical trip like his book, 700, 800 pages of narcissism. Anyway, The point is not here, point is not Netanyahu. In fact, the point is Aljazeera and what Israel is doing with Aljazeera. And what I'm saying is that this is not a Netanyahu decision per se. This is an Israel decision. And there is a coalition partners who have a vested interest in this. And my fear, as I told you, along with my anger at the decision, is that this will undermine our operation for sure in Israel-Palestine. But the point that really we need to look at is why Israel is doing that now. And I think it's doing that not because it's suddenly not democratic. It's doing that suddenly because suddenly not confident. Because suddenly it's looking more and more desperate. Because the Europeans and the Americans, because the streets and the public squares in random cities around the world are speaking out against Israel's crimes in Gaza. This is something new. We have never seen middle class and upper middle class American young and European young people revolting the way they are against the injustices that are carried by Israel in Palestine. This is distilling fear in or among Israeli leaders and especially their friends in the West. So instead of stopping the war crimes, they're trying to repress the messenger. And in this case, it's Aljazeera.
Marwan, you were just mentioning the eruption of protests in cities that we have seen actually in many countries in Europe, in Italy, in the UK, also in Australia, and many cities in the US. And it has been quite remarkable to see not just the reaction of US police and security forces, but also the political reaction to this. You speak about this ban by the Israeli government being an attempt to try and control the message, an act of desperation in light of the devastation that we see in Gaza. But I suppose also what is interesting is that in amongst this, we see this narrative emerging of outside elements and outside agitators being involved in these protests, and the suggestion that these students are being manipulated in some way to react.
So I doubt a lot of this so-called Z generation, especially in the United States, I doubt they watch news networks. I doubt they watch Aljazeera news network. They might be reading and watching and some of our social media, where we show a lot of videos and so on and so forth. I'm just saying that this generation does not watch TV per se. It watches, I don't know, YouTube and Instagram and so on and so forth. But be that as it may, I think what's interesting about, and I think your point is very important when they talk about outside agitators. This particular generation is the least generation in the history of generations that needs any incitement from outside. Okay, so this is not a laughable matter, but I just watched a clip where it says something like, this generation, for this generation, everything is problematic. Everything for this generation is problematic. You say it, it's problematic, right? And you're gonna try to pass through a genocide by this generation, and it's not gonna pay attention? Of course it's gonna pay attention. This generation is alert and has issue with everything. So when you try to lie to them and deceive them about an ongoing, unraveling, unfolding generation every day on their social media, within their network, online, they're not going to stay quiet about that. They're not going to keep quiet about that. They are the one who are inciting the rest of us. They are the one who are agitating and inciting their parents. Parents, people from the X generation, are the ones who are being agitated and excited because their children, the Z generation, are making a mess at home, or a mess on the phone, or a mess in text messaging their parents about what is going on in Gaza. In fact, I have, either as a lecturer or as a guest lecturer or as some capacity or another, even as a student, I've been in most of these universities through my career, whether they are in Europe, like France, the UK, or the United States. Whether it's Columbia University or UCLA, or whether it is Brown or NYU, I've been there, I've seen them, I've worked and talked to people. I tell you, during those past years, I've never talked to people that even resemble this new generation. This new generation does not need agitation. Now, having said all of that, let's call it an introduction. But if it was, in fact, incited and agitated by an outsider, so what? What is wrong with that? This entire civil rights movement in the United States was organized by people who worked with Dr. Luther King, and they went in and about different states, different cities, different colleges, different churches, and talked to people about civil rights. What is wrong with talking to people about injustice in Palestine? What is wrong with talking to people about the need for peace in Palestine, the need for ceasefire in Palestine? What is wrong with that? If it is peaceful and all. Now, our reporting, again, that's why we're not liked by some. Our reporting from different campuses, and I remember, Gabe Gabriel, and I remember Rob in LA, and they're going into the camping within the universities in the early days. And these were young people, peaceful people, hanging out, reading about conflict resolution and getting lectures about anti-Semitism. If they were peaceful, they have been peaceful. They actually are more moral than their parents. They are more moral than their politicians. They are even more moral than their professors and academics and so on and so forth. This is a wonderful generation. It's not ideological. This generation does not need to be incited by media.
I guess that's why it's such a threat to the establishment, right? And so this outside agitator argument is meant to generate a pretext, maybe not just for a crackdown, but also to delegitimize what we are seeing.
This is very important. You continuously raise important points, but let me disagree with that. I'll tell you why. It is definitely a very threatening voice in today's politics in the United States. Let me tell you why it's not dangerous. Because while it is networked, it's not led. There is no centralized. This is not a movement with an ideology. This is not a party. This is not a political party. This is a lot of young people who are driven by moral, ethic, and principle, and who want to speak out against injustice. So they are not exactly organized in the way where they can, for example, affect elections.
But do they want to suppress it before it gets to a stage, perhaps in years from now,
Absolutely.
where they do organize in a way that could eventually shape policy?
Absolutely, especially because this generation, from, say, 18 to 25, this is the new generation that's going to enter the elections, and they're probably registering in big numbers. And we've looked at the numbers in the so-called swing states in the United States. But let's talk about the United States for a moment, because that's where the American President Biden is feeling the heat of the new election, and that's apparently weighing in on his decisions on Palestine. So apparently between Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, at least those swing states, right? Somewhere between this movement for social justice that is revolving around solidarity with Palestine, as well as a whole number of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans of a certain age, as well as progressive and not so progressive Jewish Americans.
Across demographics.
Across demographic, across ethnicities.
Yeah.
Those people, even if they just change the vote by 10,000, by 5,000, and I think in Ohio, I think the number was. I forget the exact number, excuse me, but it's such a small number that when they try to organize and get people to vote abstain and actually go to the polling and say, voided paper, they are double the number. Yes, it's 11,000. And 22,000 already showed up at the primaries in the Democratic Party, meaning double the number needed to tell Biden, we are ready to abstain the next time around. Hence, if Biden loses Ohio, if Biden loses another swing state of that nature, since he won the 2020 elections with such margins as less than 1%, then I think clearly this generation that is entering politics between the age of 18 and 25 will have huge weight moving forward.
All right, for now, thank you very much, Marwan Bishara. We'll continue the conversation on this story a little bit later.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get latest news from Al Jazeera.